Afternoon, and thank you to everyone for taking time out of your schedules to attend today's webinar. It's great to be with you, and I'm excited to be speaking with you about such a timely and important topic. And this is such an important topic because life sciences companies continue to confront challenging financial transparency obligations that they are grappling with throughout the world in what is very much ever-evolving global transparency landscape. And I think that the timeliness and importance of these issues is highlighted by the fact that this is actually the second time I'm presenting this webinar. I did it back in August, and at that time it was the most highly attended presentation that we've done. Then we're doing it again today. So I think the overall number of attendees is pretty impressive. And while I'd like to think that that's due to, a great desire out there to hear me speak, I realize that it's really because there's so much activity right now in countries and regions throughout the world as companies are going to have to deal with more and more reporting obligations going forward. I think that most of the recent attention to this topic has been driven by France finally adopting its implementing decree for its Sunshine Law in May of this year. And then in June of 2013, the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, better known as EFPIA, adopted a new disclosure code, but there's stuff happening in other places too. So this afternoon I'll be talking about the financial transparency and reporting laws and codes in countries outside of the United States. By way of explanation, when I discuss laws or regulations, I'll be referring to some type of government action and government-imposed requirement. On the other hand, when I refer to codes, I'll be referring to voluntary codes promulgated by various industry groups and associations, like EFPIA. This type of self-regulation does not have the same legal impact and force as a governmental law or governmental regulation. However, these codes are binding on members of the group, and a violation of the code can lead to penalties in some of the countries. I thought I would start off by showing you the itinerary that we'll be using today. We'll begin by talking about the European Union and the IFPMA, and then we'll start talking about some of the laws that have been enacted in Europe, like France, Slovakia, Portugal, Denmark. Then we'll refocus and talk more about industry codes. We can see with EFPIA and EUCOMED, which represents the medical device industry in Europe. Then we'll hit the Netherlands, the UK, in Europe as well. Then we'll hit Japan and Australia, and finish up with the Middle East and Africa, and possibly a few other spots depending on how much time we may have left. And as we take a quick tour of these transparency hotspots, I'm not going to get bogged down in all the details of the various laws and codes that we'll be talking about, because that kind of detailed information will be available to you in the slides. And also, if I tried to explain all these details, this webinar would quickly go from an hour and a half to probably a day and a half or so. So instead, we'll do a quick overview of the reporting obligations and the disclosure requirements in these key countries. And I'll also talk a little bit about why certain laws or codes were passed. We can be aware of the factors that are driving this trend toward more transparency. So we'll be able to better recognize additional jurisdictions that may enact financial transparency requirements in the future. As we go through these countries and take this tour this afternoon, some of the big picture items to keep in mind. Is a transparency requirement contained in a law or a code? Something I've already touched on. Countries like France, Slovakia, Portugal have enacted laws, while transparency requirements have been enacted through industry codes in countries like the UK, Netherlands, Japan, and Australia. It's an important distinction for several reasons, the most important one being if your company is not one that is a member of a industry group in a particular jurisdiction, then the code's requirements may not apply to you. In contrast, if it's a law and you're doing business or the law is applicable to you for a given jurisdiction, then it will apply. Secondly, is there a threshold for reporting? This is an important issue. In the Netherlands, under the current industry code, which we'll talk about later, it's €500 per year. For France, for certain benefits that are provided, the threshold for reporting is €10. So this is one of the details of reporting that companies must be cognizant of. It's important to think about thresholds both as governments are considering enacting laws or as an industry group is debating whether to adopt a code. And it's also very important in terms of capture and how you set up your system to ultimately be able to produce reports that are compliant with the governing scheme. Next, we have aggregate versus individual reporting. This is obviously a very big impact on how you go about capturing data and complying with the reporting requirements. Currently, the industry groups in some countries, like Australia and the UK, have aggregate requirements, but we are quickly moving toward more individual level reporting. In fact, individual level reporting is the scheme that the new EFPIA code has embraced, and that's going to be kind of the trend that we'll see across Europe. And although Australia currently has aggregate, it's also moving toward individual level reporting, as I'll talk about later. Next, we see the timing for disclosure. Most countries are looking at an annual report, but it may be at the end of the first quarter, it may be within the first 6 months, so it's important to know what the applicable deadline is. And of course, you have other instances, for example, France, where it's on a different system, and we'll talk about that later. The type of data to be disclosed and how much detail is required. This is important to find out what each jurisdiction is doing. Do you have to report the names of an HCP? How much detail about the HCP, their address, license number, specialty, other information, just something to keep an eye on as you are considering how to go about complying with these requirements. Recipients, generally we're talking about HCPs, HCOs, some others including patient organizations. Again, it's important to see how each jurisdiction defines who is covered by their reporting requirement. Generally, very generally, it's doctors, nurses, pharmacists, but we'll talk a little bit about France. It has a much wider scope in terms of who's covered and who reports have to be filed about. Are there penalties for violations? Hopefully everyone is able to comply with whatever the governing requirement is, and penalties becomes a non-issue. But it's important to know if there are penalties. Most industry groups have some type of sanction available, but not all do. But generally, when we're talking about laws, like we will see in France, there are definite and fairly burdensome penalties and sanctions associated with violations. Lastly, just a difference between the pharmaceutical industry and the medical device industry as we stand right now. Currently, the pharmaceutical industry is much further along than the medical device industry in terms of adopting industry codes that contain reporting requirements. Perhaps the best example of this distinction is what we see in Europe, on the European level. The European Pharmaceutical Industry Group, EFPIA, has already adopted its disclosure code that we'll talk about. It's going to require individual level reporting beginning in 2016 to cover 2015 data. In contrast, EUCOMED, which represents the medical device industry in Europe, does not have any current reporting requirements, either at the aggregate or individual level, and to date has not announced any plans to move in that direction. So generally, pharmaceutical industry, a lot more activity, medical device not so much, but where the medical device industry is most impacted is by these laws. France law applies to both pharmaceutical companies and medical device companies. Other pending legislation also would apply to both industries, but it's important for the medical device industry to be aware of what's happening and to see if they start to move in a more self-regulatory direction as well. Now, when I was preparing for this webinar originally over the summer, the idea of going on a global tour and stopping off at a bunch of different countries made me think about music and bands going on tours around the world. Now, I don't want to say I was easily distracted from studying the intricacies of Slovakian statutory law, because I've got a lot of really scintillating Slovakian stuff coming up later. But once I got the idea of bands in my head along with the topic of sunshine, all I was able to do was think about songs about sunshine. There's a lot of them. We have the Doors out from California, one of their more famous songs, Waiting for the Sun. The Beach Boys, I think pretty much every single one of their songs involves the sun or sunshine in some way. You have the Red Hot Chili Peppers, another California band, one of their more famous songs, Behind the Sun. It's actually pretty hard to find a suitable picture of these guys to put up in a webinar, but I was able to find this one. Then we have the Eagles with Tequila Sunrise. Again, California band. I'm starting to notice a trend here. But as I was thinking about all this, I started to think if there was some way for me to combine two of my greatest loves, which are music and, it almost goes without saying, my other one is the evolution of the financial transparency movement in the life sciences industry, to make this webinar more accessible and entertaining. and perhaps make it more memorable for the audience to help you recall certain things that we talk about today. And that's when it dawned on me. I should use a band's song titles for each stop on the Global Transparency Tour as a reflection of what's going on in that jurisdiction. At first, I was thinking about going with the Beach Boys because so many of their songs are about the sun and sunshine, but then it hit me. Who would I want to go on tour with? Whose music is the perfect companion for any situation? Who does the audience want? And the answer became clear. Bruce Springsteen. Now, I know what you're thinking. Here's this New Jersey guy ignoring so many great bands and just picking the king of New Jersey, the boss. What a stereotypical provincial thing for a New Jersey guy to do. And I have a difficult time disputing that or arguing with you on that point. But in addition to that, I picked Bruce for a different reason too. And it's because this global transparency movement started in America. We see that in the Netherlands. We see that in Japan. We see that with EFPIA. We see that even with UCOMED when they talk about the global transparency movement. All these different places around the world say that their involvement in reporting requirements was influenced by or even caused by what was happening here in America. So in a sense, I think it's fair to say that the global trend was actually born in the USA, and that's why I picked Bruce, separate and apart from the blood oath that I, like all New Jerseyans, take to spread the gospel of Bruce at all times. So as we go through these different hotspots around the world, I've included Bruce song titles on the slides to help indicate what's going on in that particular jurisdiction. I won't be providing deep analysis for why I picked the songs, but I hope it's fairly self-evident and that the use of these song titles will help make what we talk about there a little bit more accessible. And I realize that some of you, perhaps those of you who may not even be Bruce fans, might be skeptical about this, but I assure you that the feedback that we got on the first webinar worked out pretty well. Most of the feedback I got was in the form of emails saying, thanks for the presentation, huge Bruce fan, and by the way, can I get the slides? So at this point, let me just reiterate that if you would like, we can send these slides out to you. So please just feel free to email me and we'll get that out to you. And if you're like the last audience, if you'd like to find out why I didn't pick Born to Run or Rosalita or your favorite Bruce song, I'd be happy to talk to you about that too, or what's happening in the Netherlands and Japan and everywhere else on the global transparency front. So with that introduction, let's get going in terms of our stops around the world. First, we have the European Union. There are no disclosure or reporting requirements in any of the current EU directives or regulations governing this field. Next, the IFPMA, which is the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations. The IFPMA was founded in 1968. It's a global, nonprofit, non-governmental organization that represents the pharma industry. Its members include both pharma companies and national and regional pharmaceutical industry associations, for example, like EFPIA. The IFPMA has developed a code to govern the promotion of pharmaceutical products to healthcare professionals. But most importantly, for purposes of our conversation today, there are no disclosure or reporting requirements. The code was most recently amended in March 2012. Those amendments went into effect in September of 2012. But so far, there's been no movement for the IFPMA to adopt any type of reporting requirements in its code. Next, I'd like to move into the countries that have laws, and we'll start with France because its Sunshine Act is probably the most well-known and controversial in this space. Before we get into the details of the law's provisions and implementing decree, I thought it would be helpful to provide a little bit of background on why France passed the Sunshine Law so we can have a better understanding of the trend toward more transparency and what we should be on the lookout for in other jurisdictions. In France, a diabetes drug mediator was prescribed for over about 30 years or so to about 5 million French patients. It was also prescribed for weight loss purposes, and ultimately it was discovered that there was a possible cardiovascular risk, which led to the drug being pulled off the market in 2009. It became a huge controversy and was described by some as the biggest public health scandal in France in many years. Some officials have estimated that over 2,000 people have died and thousands more have been hospitalized as a result of heart valve damage that was allegedly caused by the drug. The company was accused of promoting to doctors that the drug be prescribed for weight loss purposes as opposed for diabetes treatment in order to boost sales. There have been many investigations and some ongoing prosecutions and legal proceedings in France relating to this entire episode. But most importantly for our discussion, it led to the passage in December of 2011 of the French Sunshine Act, which is part of a much larger package of reforms that completely reshaped the healthcare regulatory system in France. Separate and apart from the Sunshine Act provisions, the Reform Act retitled the government agency responsible for supervision of the industry, gave it far more powers, and there will be closer governmental monitoring and surveillance of pharmaceuticals and medical devices as a result of the law. So in some senses, France is like the U.S. in terms of its Sunshine Act being part of a broader healthcare reform. So this law was passed in December of 2011, and it generally requires that companies, both medical device companies and pharmaceutical companies, disclose to the public all agreements that they have with and certain benefits that they give to specified recipients. And we'll flesh that out in a minute. But because the law was general, there was supposed to be an implementing decree that would spell out all the law's details and flesh out all the requirements. That decree was supposed to be in place by August 1 of 2012. And this was in part due to the fact that the law indicated that data capture was to begin in January of 2012. Well, August 1, 2012 came and went without an implementing decree. Several drafts were promulgated. There were always lots of rumors and speculation about when the final decree would come out and what would be in it. But for a long time, people just kept waiting. I gave numerous talks at conferences and presentations over the course of 2012 and beginning of 2013, and always kind of had a big question mark about when the implementing decree would come out. But it finally did come out on May 21st, 2013. And the French Ministry of Health and Social Affairs also published a circular, which is kind of like a guidance document, to provide additional information about certain portions of the final decree, help with its implementation. So the final decree imposes the two main types of disclosure requirements on pharma and medical device companies. And as we can see here, there are 9 different categories of covered recipients to whom this applies. Companies must disclose the existence of agreements they have with and certain benefits that they provide to these 9 groups. Up top we have HCPs, and one significant note, it's highlighted there, but the disclosure requirements do not apply to the reporting company's employees. Thus, a company who's paying an HCP who's a direct employee for his or her services is with the company, that does not have to be reported. But we have others up here as well. Associations, health facilities, foundations. Number 7 is an interesting one. Publishing companies, press, radio, television, online media. Editors of prescription dispensing software, and legal entities that train healthcare professionals. So it's a pretty broad scope of who's covered by the French Sunshine Act. So going back, agreements and benefits. Those are the 2 things that must be disclosed. A lot of what must be disclosed is similar, but there are some differences between the 2 types of reportable activities. For agreements, companies have to reveal the identity of the parties to the agreement. When you're dealing with an HCP, you have individual level information, name, address, qualifications, registration number with your relevant professional board. When you have healthcare students, you have different information. Then when you're dealing with an association or one of the other categories that we saw on the prior screen, you have different information, name, corporate purpose, registered address. You have the date when the agreement was signed, subject matter of the agreement. This is important. The company should phrase it in such a way that it does not disclose confidential or trade secret information. And to the extent the agreement pertains to a promotional or scientific event, the program should be included as well. For benefits, here we're talking about a threshold, which I mentioned before. Whether it's a direct benefit or an indirect benefit, whether it be in kind or in cash, when you give something to any of the aforementioned recipients of a benefit that's equal to or greater than 10 euros, inclusive of VAT, that has to be reported. So that's a very low threshold. Benefits worth less than 10 euros do not have to be disclosed. And when we're talking about disclosure of benefits, companies have to provide the same type of personal information that we saw with agreements on the prior slide, as well as some additional information including the amount of each benefit. And you may have noticed that the amount did not have to be disclosed for the agreements. in terms of this transparency disclosure report, the date and nature of each benefit and the time period, be it the first 6 months or the latter 6 months of a year. All of this information about both benefits and agreements will eventually be disclosed by companies on a to-be-established public website that will be set up and run by the government. The information will be posted and made available in French and will be available for a period of 5 years on this public website. In terms of timing, the way the system currently is once the public website is up and operational, agreements will have to be reported by companies to this authority within 15 days of the signing of the agreement. So if you sign the agreement on January 1, but hopefully you're not doing work on January 1, but let's say January 3rd, you have 15 days until the 18th to submit it. For benefits, it's not nearly as onerous. Instead of 15 days, you have to report biannually, by August 1 for benefits that were given from January to June of the calendar year, and then by February 1 of the following year for benefits given between July and December of the prior year. But because the public website is not yet operational, the decree provided for a different reporting scheme until the website is ready. We tried to put this out here, and I'll walk you through this as we go. So May 21st, the decree is issued. And in that decree, it provides that by June 1st, or roughly 10 days later, all reportable benefits and agreements that were made during calendar year 2012 were due. That information, all the information we saw about agreements and benefits and what had to be reported, everything for 2012 had to be reported to the appropriate National Council of the Healthcare Professionals Association by June 1. So for HCPs and when you're dealing with doctors, you would send it to the doctors group, all your company information about agreements and benefits given with doctors. For nurses, to the National Council of Nurses, and on down the line. So you had roughly 10 days to report everything from 2012. The next deadline was August 1, 2013. That deadline was for everything, benefits, agreements made during the first 6 months of calendar year 2013. And again, that information was to go to the National Doctors Group, National Nurses Group, whatever the applicable covered recipient category was. And then all of this information covering 2012 and the first 6 months of 2013 is supposed to be published and made public on October 1 of this year. The reports are to be published. And it's supposed to be published in 2 separate types of locations. The first one is on the website of the applicable HCP group. So the French National Doctors Association is supposed to put all this information about its members up on its website. And the reporting company, be it the pharma company, be it the med device company, it has to put all this information about agreements and benefits from 2012 and the first 6 months of 2013 up on its own website as well. So that's kind of the interim reporting scheme until the public website is operational. So frankly, the time period to do reporting for 2012 and the first 6 months of 2013 has already passed under the decree's scheme. And different companies have been and are currently dealing with those disclosure requirements on the public information in various ways. The next report would be due February 1, 2014, and that is to cover the latter 6 months of 2013 activities on agreements and benefits. It's unlikely that the French public administration will have the website up and operational then, so it's anticipated that it will have the same type thing, whereby February 1, companies need to report to the National Doctors Group or National Nurses Group information about agreements and benefits in the last 6 months of 2013, and that information will probably be made public 2 months later by April 1. So that's the current state of the law in France. And although the decree and the circular provide many important details about the French transparency system and imposes a lot of requirements on life science companies, there are still a lot of open questions that companies are grappling with. For example, the distinction between having to report value for benefits but not agreements. And is that something that may be further addressed in the future by additional decrees or circulars? Also, it's not entirely clear to some in terms of the scope of the French Act. Does it apply only to French-based companies? Does it apply to companies outside of France who don't have a physical presence in France but are doing business in France or otherwise interacting with French HCPs? So these are the kind of open questions that are still being considered and evaluated by those in the industry. So we'll continue to wait for answers to those questions as well as the operational details of the public website and see how that is developed by the French government. As you might expect, the French pharmaceutical industry group was not particularly pleased with the decree when it came out in May of this year. It issued a press release. I'm not sure if this is the exact translation, but, quote, Decree on Transparency Links, LEAM, which is the name of the group, deplores the cumbersome system. LEAM took issue with a short reporting time frame, many of the issues we talked about a moment ago in terms of the open questions. But unless and until the French government reverses course, which no one is really expecting, this is a governing system in France going forward and some of the reporting requirements that companies are going to have to be dealing with. So now I'd like to leave France and head to Slovakia, which is another area where we've seen some transparency legislation. In Slovakia, a law was passed in September, the Act on Drugs and Medical Aid, number 362, passed in September of 2011. As far as I can tell, there was no precipitating event equivalent to the mediator scandal, but the purpose of the Slovakian government in passing this law was twofold: to act against perceived bribery in the pharmaceutical HCP relationship and cost control. On that front, the Minister of the Health of the Slovak Republic indicated that although pharmaceutical companies, and I'm paraphrasing his statement on this issue, although pharmaceutical companies strongly resisted the law and the transparency measures, the enactment of the law would lead to a great savings in terms of the reduction in prices of medicines, as pharmaceutical companies and others would not have to spend so much on doctors, but it could instead devote those savings to the reduction of the price of the products. So this is kind of a mindset that you see with some governments and legislators and legislatures when they're trying to go about imposing governmental laws. So in terms of the transparency requirements, pharmaceutical companies have to report on the value of advertising and marketing expenses and non-monetary benefits on an annual basis in Slovakia. That report has to be sent annually to the Ministry of Health by January 31st. And then the Ministry of Health publishes the report on its website. There are some other restrictions on what companies can do in Slovakia in terms of events. Certain types of events, including conferences and seminars, can't be financed, sponsored, or otherwise supported by companies, whether directly or indirectly, unless certain purposes are met, expert, scientific, or educational. Also, a list of HCPs who attend such events have to be submitted as soon as possible, and then those lists are published and made available online. Portugal entered the transparency fray earlier this year. This law, number 20 of 2013, was passed on February the 14th, and this was an amendment to Portugal's Medicinal Products Act. Like the other European laws, the Portuguese amendment addressed a wide range of topics relating to many different aspects of drug safety, but it did establish some new reporting requirements for several actors in the healthcare field. Under the amendment, pharmaceutical companies have to report to the Portuguese National Authority of Medicines and Health Products on the grant of any financial support to patient organizations. So that's the limited role of reporting for pharmaceutical companies in Portugal with respect to patient organizations. However, there's a reporting requirement on patient organizations, scientific associations, and healthcare professionals, including doctors, dentists, pharmacists, nurses, because they have to submit to the Portuguese Health Ministry about financial support that they receive from pharmaceutical companies if such support exceeds 25 euros. So unlike where we see in France or Slovakia, where the burden to report is on the pharmaceutical companies, in Portugal the burden is shifted to the HCOs and the HCPs to actually do the reporting once the support goes above the 25 euro threshold. And then that information is to be published online as well and made available to the public. So the support provided by pharmaceutical companies will be seen, but the burden to do the reporting is not on the companies themselves. As you might expect, many actors in the healthcare field were not thrilled with this new development and the obligation to report that was imposed on them individually. There's been some talk about some type of legal challenges or things like that, especially as it relates to data protection, but we'll have to keep an eye on that and see what happens going forward in Portugal to see if there are any changes to that new scheme. The next country I'd like to talk about is Denmark. And Denmark is interesting because they have some current requirements in place, but it's expected that they're going to move to a more comprehensive reporting system. Right now, in Denmark, healthcare professionals must, as an initial matter, obtain permission from the Danish Health and Medicines Authority before they can establish a relationship with or otherwise collaborate with a pharmaceutical company. In turn, pharmaceutical companies have to report to that Danish agency by January 31st every year all doctors, dentists, pharmacists with whom that they have collaborated. Pharmaceutical companies have to provide certain information about the financial relationships, but they do not have to identify financial compensation or benefits that are provided. Instead, the information is more limited in terms of general information about the relationship, not as to financial transparency matters. However, it's expected that Denmark will be considering and adopting new legislation that would apply to both pharmaceutical companies as well as medical device companies. And under this anticipated legislative amendment, it is the healthcare professionals, not the companies, who will have the primary reporting obligation. And that's similar to what we saw and just talked about in Portugal. It's expected that healthcare professionals will have to disclose the amount of fees that they receive for research, fees for education and speaking, consultant fees, including fees that they may get for service on advisory boards, as well as market research support, events, and other sponsorships. Further, it's anticipated that the Danish Health and Medicines Authority will then disclose all this individual level data that's provided by the HCPs and make it available on its website. There's a few other countries, Estonia, Latvia, in Eastern Europe, that have not so much the Denmark system, but more Slovakia in terms of some reporting that has to be done on events and things like that. But these are the main countries where we've seen laws. The most comprehensive one being France. It'll be interesting to see if countries that are interested in adopting Sunshine Acts are influenced by what's happening here in the U.S. As well as France. But since there are still many countries that do not have laws, industry groups are trying to kind of fill that void and, in essence, maybe preempt the need for governments to get involved and externally impose these kind of reporting requirements. Instead, we'll be developing self-regulation in the form of industry codes. Perhaps we've seen that most with EFPIA. As I mentioned, EFPIA represents the pharmaceutical industry in Europe. Its members are the national industry associations of 33 European countries and approximately 40 pharmaceutical companies as well. There are 19 full member associations and 14 affiliate member associations, which are the national groups, and we have a slide on that later in terms of who they all are. And when we're talking about EFPIA, we're really going to be talking about three EFPIA codes. One that governs interactions with healthcare professionals, one that governs interactions with patient organizations, and the most important one, the new one that I mentioned before that was adopted in June of this year that governs transfers of values to HCPs and HCOs. The name of that new code is EFPIA Code on Disclosure of Transfers of Value from Pharmaceutical Companies to Healthcare Professionals and Healthcare Organizations, which really rolls right off the tongue as I say it. So for ease of reference, I'm just going to be referring to it as EFPIA's Disclosure Code today. As I mentioned, the code was adopted in June of 2013. It was motivated in large part by EFPIA's view that its earlier codes, the Patient Organization and HCP code, were outdated and were falling behind what governments like France and Slovakia were starting to do throughout the world in imposing reporting requirements. The code, the disclosure code, as well as the other codes, apply to EFPIA's member companies, their subsidiaries, and any companies affiliated with EFPIA member companies, as well as any companies that voluntarily agrees to be bound by the code. Now, before we talk about the new disclosure code, just by way of background and history in a sense. We'll focus on the HCP code for a moment. The HCP code was most recently amended in June of 2011, went into effect in January of 2012. As we can see, under that code, companies were only encouraged, it was not mandatory, to make publicly available information about donations, grants, benefits that they gave to healthcare professional organizations and institutions. But again, this was just encouragement. This wasn't the kind of individual level detail or anything else that we will see when we talk about the new disclosure code. The EFPIA code, with respect to patient organizations, did, however, contain some reporting requirements. Companies were required to make publicly available a list of organizations that they provided financial support and/or significant or indirect or non-financial support. That information had to be provided on a national or European level and had to be updated at least once a year. That obligation went into effect to capture data beginning in January of 2012 for the first time, with the first reports to be issued at the end of the first quarter of 2013. You can see here some of the details about that in terms of what had to be reported by member companies. But in view of kind of the lack of significant reporting requirements in either of these codes and seeing what was happening in the different countries around the world, in October 2012, EFPIA issued a statement titled EFPIA Transparency with Healthcare Professionals. It talked about the existing codes of ethics that it had, the national regulations that were coming into effect, and EFPIA recognized that there was growing public interest in understanding the nature of the relationships between HCPs and industry. As a result, EFPIA went about working with its stakeholders, various other groups, to develop the disclosure code that it ultimately came up with, in the hope, frankly, that it would be able to encourage a consistent approach to data disclosure in Europe and to help guide further action at a national level. In a sense, EFPIA's hope was by adopting this code, it will then be implemented by national members, and there will be one kind of consistent norm across the board in Europe. There would be some pockets like France or Slovakia where laws would be in place, that would have, and we'll talk about how that would have to be managed under EFPIA's disclosure code. But EFPIA's hope is really to try to kind of preempt the field, get one system in place covering Europe, and discourage or dissuade governments from feeling the need to weigh in, as France did, and come up with their own scheme, one that would probably be far more onerous than the self-regulatory scheme that EFPIA and the industry groups could come up with. So, I'm sorry, this was just a continuation of the publicly available list of patient organizations in terms of the slide. Before we talk about the actual disclosure provisions and what must be reported under EFPIA's new disclosure code, I just want to give you a quick timeline in terms of what's happened and what will be happening with EFPIA. The EFPIA board approved the final version of the disclosure code in February of 2013. It then was adopted in June in Brussels at EFPIA's annual meeting. Then the next important date is December 31st, 2013. Under the code, all 33 member associations across Europe have to transpose the new disclosure requirements in the EFPIA disclosure code into their own national codes by the end of this year. An EFPIA committee will then review the status of code transposition to national codes and report to EFPIA's board in 2014 in April. And then companies are to begin collecting data in 2015 with individual level disclosures to begin in 2016. Under the EFPIA code, first disclosures will have to be made in the first 6 months, so by the end of June 2016, to cover 2015 data. So those are the dates that we need to keep our eyes on. Now, what has to be disclosed? We tried to break it up into, there's still some aggregate reporting, then we have individual level HCO reporting, and we have individual level HCP reporting. As you can see there, we have first disclosures 2016 to cover 2015 data. For the aggregate, we're talking about R&D and transfers of value to both HCPs and HCOs concerning the planning and conduct of non-clinical studies, clinical trials, and non-interventional studies, as that is outlined there. Then when we get to the individual level HCOs, we're talking about donations and grants to HCOs and contributions to the cost of events, sponsorship agreements, both those with HCOs and third parties that are hired to manage events, registration fees, travel and accommodation. And then separate and apart from donations and grants, we have service and consultant fees, where fees have to be reported as well as related expenses. And similar kind of individual level reporting for HCPs. We're looking at events, registration fees, travel and accommodation, and the same kind of thing when we're talking about service and consultant fees has to be reported on the individual level for HCPs. Now, EFPIA, in order to help companies and its member associations understand the system, provided a template schedule with all the different categories to try to make it easier to understand the requirements. And that template is here. It's probably fairly difficult to see, but that goes back to my earlier point about please contacting us, and we'll be happy to share these slides with you. But as you can see, we have all the different categories, the different levels, the yearly amounts, where things need to be added up, and at the bottom we have the aggregate disclosures, total amounts, as you can see when you look to the far right, second to the right, transfers of value for R&D and where that gets aggregated. So that's kind of a high-level overview of what needs to be reported, and I'd be happy to share, again, this information with anyone who's interested in seeing it. Now, you may have noticed that gifts and meals are not included in EFPIA's reporting requirements. EFPIA studied that issue and thought about making those reportable, but instead chose a different approach in terms of how it would treat gifts and meals. For gifts, as a general matter, and this has been the case for some time, gifts can't be provided as an incentive to recommend, purchase, or supply a drug for an HCP. However, gifts of medical utility that are aimed directly at the education of HCPs are permissible so long as they are inexpensive. And the same thing in terms of information or educational documentation, so long as it is inexpensive and directly relevant to the practice of medicine and directly benefits patient care, those type of gifts are permissible. And significantly, in terms of quote-unquote inexpensive, each national association, all 33 members in the European countries, each of them will have to define what's considered inexpensive in their jurisdiction. It's the same kind of thing for meals and drinks. Under the EFPIA system, meals and drinks can't be provided above a monetary threshold, and every member association has to set that monetary threshold by the end of this year. Those amounts don't have to be reported because the idea is if it's under the threshold, it's permissible, and every national association will get to decide what it determines is reasonable and appropriate. So that's something that companies are going to have to keep an eye on. If the UK says it's reasonable to give a meal of 50 euro, then that's okay there. France might have a different one. Greece could be somewhere else. Italy could have different threshold levels as well for gifts and meals. So that's something that there may be some variation across the continent in terms of how different countries treat gifts and meals. In terms of where this report, looking at the template, where all this information is going to go, EFPIA envisions that it will be posted on company websites, or the national member associations will develop some kind of central registry where companies can submit the information, and then the National Association will make all the information public. Under the EFPIA code, all the disclosures have to be in the local language. So if you're in Italy, the disclosure will have to be in Italian and whatever other country you may be having to report in. However, EFPIA also encourages all companies to make the disclosures in English if it is not the local language. As I mentioned before, December 31st, 2013 is a key deadline because that's when all the member associations are supposed to have incorporated the EFPIA disclosure provisions and established the disclosure system and set the limit threshold for gifts and meals. In the wake of EFPIA adopting this, many national associations put out press releases expressing their support. One example is Sweden, where they we're happy to continue the work they've done in the transparency and we'll be implementing EFPIA, but we'll have to do so, they stressed, in a way that is consistent with data privacy laws in Sweden. Data privacy is a huge issue, and we'll try to touch upon that a little bit later. The UK, we'll talk about this, is already moving forward and has a schedule for how it's going to go about adopting EFPIA's provisions in order to meet the December 31st deadline. But there is some skepticism about whether all the associations in all 33 countries will be able to meet the deadline. And speaking with many folks in Europe and doing business in Europe, there's, I'd say, some very healthy skepticism that all the countries will be there by the end of this year. Some may, we expect some will, but we're just going to have to keep an eye on that and see how different countries go about doing it, and when they do it, what kind of details they actually put in. One other issue that's important is how will a country like France, how is it supposed to comply, the National Industry Group, which is LIM, with both EFPIA and the French law, because they're different. The scope in France is much broader of covered recipients. You have the 15-day agreement requirement to report on, the €10 threshold for benefits. EFPIA recognizes that some jurisdictions will have laws or other requirements in place, so they will allow their member associations in those countries to kind of deviate from the EFPIA code to make it consistent with whatever's in place. But the idea is to hopefully try to harmonize it so that the reporting obligation on companies in those jurisdictions won't be terribly redundant and excessively burdensome. So to the extent a EFPIA provision conflicts with local law will govern, and the national member associations are going to have to deal with that in their individual codes. Another important note about the EFPIA disclosure code is that it requires every company to publish a note summarizing the methodologies that they used in preparing their disclosures and identifying transfers of value for each category that's described in this template here. And on that issue, the methodology is intended to deal with issues, country-specific considerations. Companies are supposed to provide a general summary about the recognition methodologies that were applied, how they treat multi-year contracts, VAT and other tax issues, currency issues, timing issues, various other things. So there are going to be some open questions probably as companies deal with the EFPIA code and then how it's being implemented in national member associations. So one way that companies can deal with that, in addition to working directly with the National Industry Group, is also in terms of the detail of the methodology note that they prepare and make available to the public in terms of how they went about making these calculations and coming up with their reports. Lastly, it's important to note that the disclosure code of EFPIA does require national groups to include sanctions for violations. EFPIA doesn't specify what the sanctions should be, but instead leaves it up to the individual national groups to come up with what's appropriate in their jurisdiction. So we're also going to see some variation there. Just to give you a sense of which countries are involved in EFPIA, the 33, these are the full members that we see. Generally, we're looking at mostly members of the EU, and we also have non-EU in terms of Russia and Switzerland. These are the EFPIA affiliate members. So EFPIA's the implementation of EFPIA's disclosure code in all these countries is going to have a huge impact in Europe on how transparency reporting goes. The promised land here for Europe is really what EFPIA is hoping for is one standard, one type of reporting that will apply in all of these countries. Obviously, that's not going to be possible because we have France and we have some of these outliers where governmental laws will have to be accounted for. But ideally, EFPIA's system will be implemented and we'll have a fairly consistent transparency system in Europe. But whether that happens and whether governmental regulators and legislatures will decide to inject themselves and kind of destroy EFPIA's hope of a uniform system, we'll just have to wait and see on that. Obviously, the more changes that governments make or that the national member associations make to the EFPIA disclosure code will reduce consistency, and the more difficult it will be for companies to develop systems to meet their obligations across Europe. So that's kind of where we stand on the European level and what will be happening in individual jurisdictions under the EFPIA disclosure code for the pharmaceutical industry. In contrast, EUCOMED has not been nearly as active as EFPIA in terms of developing reporting requirements for its industry, the medical device industry. EUCOMED has a code of ethical business practice, and a number of which deal with interactions with HCPs, a number of provisions, but there are no financial transparency requirements. As you can see here, EUCOMED generally supports transparency. It endorses the principle of transparency, encourages companies to maintain appropriate transparency by dealing with HCPs in a manner that's compliant with local law. But the type of template and schedule and individual level HCP reporting that we see for EFPIA is simply absent with EUCOMED. It's not to say that they're unaware of the issues, because in September of last year, about a year ago, EUCOMED put out a paper, a white paper, where it discussed the transparency movement. And it recognized that countries like the US and France and Slovakia had enacted laws, and other countries were moving in the direction of self-regulation. So they recognized that this was happening, but they didn't come out and say, hey, we're going to do it too, or we like this idea, it's great, we're going to develop our own system. Instead, they kind of said, we know this is happening, and if you, be it a government or anyone else, is interested in doing that kind of thing, here's our thoughts on how it should be limited and restricted in terms of these different categories. So when they were talking about categories of payments and transfers of value to be reported, they narrowly defined what had to be reported, not nearly as broad as EFPIA or France. Carve-outs, they included a lot of carve-outs in terms of they encouraged the implementation of reasonable thresholds, wanted to carve out expert witness fees, various things like that to make the reporting requirements less burdensome. Recipients, that would be carefully defined, not nearly as broad as what we saw in France. The obligation to publish and disclose, that dealt kind of with their view on cross-border issues, and their thought was it should be where the HCP is mainly professionally active. That's the law or code of the jurisdiction that should control. In terms of level of detail, it was far more general in terms of the information that had to be collected and reported on for each HCP. Publication frequency, at that time some of the French draft decrees had been out with the 15-day obligation to report once an agreement was signed. So EUCOMED wasn't crazy about that. They suggested once a year to just reflect the prior year. Publication place, they favored the central registry. And in terms of timing, they essentially said, we need to have some time built in if anyone is considering developing or imposing requirements on the medical device industry. We can't just turn around and say in 10 days put together retroactive reporting as the French implementing decree ultimately required companies to do. So this was kind of EUCOMED's take on the whole issue of transparency, and it's my understanding that they have not announced or moved away from that position or otherwise endorsed or embraced the concept of developing a self-regulatory code that would include financial transparency reporting requirements. That being said, one of the big questions is, will EFPIA's activity motivate EUCOMED to act? It's hard to say. It may come down to what happens with the individual countries, what the 33 countries do with the EFPIA code, how much deviation there is, how data collection goes in 2015, what the reports look like in 2016, whether more governments get involved. Any of those factors could motivate EUCOMED to act and impose these kind of reporting requirements as a self-regulatory matter. So that's what's happening on the European level, both with the medical device industry and the pharmaceutical industry. Next, I'd like to talk about what's happening in terms of a few countries with respect to the pharmaceutical industry and some reporting that has already taken place even in advance of what's being required with EFPIA moving forward into the 2016 reports. One country where we've already seen individual level HCP reporting is the Netherlands, and that happened for the first time in 2013. Just by way of background, In 2009, the Dutch Minister of Health requested that industry come up with some kind of mechanism to disclose the financial relationships between industry and HCPs. And that was motivated in part by what was happening in the U.S. and the Sunshine Movement, but also some public and political attention that was given to the relationship between HCP and industry in the Netherlands. So industry, the pharmaceutical industry, worked with HCPs and various other interested stakeholders to come up with a self-regulating code. In doing so, one of the key things that the stakeholders worked on was privacy, and they worked together to ensure that the system that they developed complied with the Dutch Protection Act, so that this system, which I'm about to outline in these next few slides, satisfies everyone in terms of protection of personal data in the Netherlands. So there are two types of agreements that have to be disclosed by pharmaceutical companies under the Dutch system. First, service agreements with HCPs or partnership associations made up of HCPs. And then there are different categories of service agreements. We have consulting, advisory, speaker, non-WMO speaker research, then kind of a catch-all other category. Then we have sponsorship agreements for meetings between companies and associations of HCPs that improve healthcare to patients or promote or otherwise promote medical science. So those are our two types of activities that we're reporting on. The amount of disclosure, I mentioned this before, threshold of €500 per calendar year. If the total amount of the relationship between the company and the HCP or institution is less than €500, that does not have to be reported. If greater, then it does have to be reported. Manner of disclosure, companies are required to upload the data to a central registry via a system that was developed by the Dutch industry group. In terms of the information to be provided, we have it here. First, you have to identify whether it's a service or sponsorship agreement. Then for service agreements, the type of information you'd expect to see: name, specialization, work address, the amount paid, other information, identifying information. And for sponsorship agreements, same kind of information and amount paid in a calendar year. So this code actually went into effect in January of 2012. Data capture began in January 2012. Companies were to upload the information to Central Register by the end of the first quarter. By April 12th, HCPs and HCOs were able to review the information that the pharma companies provided. For the next week, companies and HCPs and HCOs were able to resolve any differences they had about the information to be reported. And then on April 25th, the register with all the information went live, public on this website. And anyone who wants to check out what's happening in the Netherlands with the financial transparency can go to that website and see. One important thing to note is in terms of searching that database, it's searchable by HCP, but it's not searchable by company. So you can search for Dr. John Smith. I assume there is one there. Dr. Smith is always mentioned in all of these types of presentations. So you can see what he received, but you can't see what pharma company X gave in the aggregate. You can't just type in pharma company X and see that they spent €20 million. It's only available to be searched by HCPs. On April 25th, which was the same day that the register went public, the Dutch industry group issued a press release kind of touting its success in being the first country industry group out of the box to require individual level HCP reporting. It noted that it was leading the way in Europe with respect to self-regulation on the individual level reporting, and that other countries, including the UK, which just so happens to be the next country I'll be talking about, was looking to their system as a model. Along the same lines, the government expressed its support for this initiative. The Dutch Minister of Health, Welfare and Sport issued a statement expressing pride in the creation of this transparency register and complimenting all those involved, the stakeholders, industry, the HCPs, academic groups, to come up with such a system and have it available and out there already. So it's important to see if other countries will, in fact, use the Dutch model as a system, especially in terms of the central registry, because as I mentioned, under the EFPIA system, it's up to national member groups to decide if they want to do a central registry like the Netherlands, or if they want to simply require their members to post the information on their own website. And in terms of, excuse me, the amount of financial support, if I remember correctly, the Dutch industry group reported that about 30 million euro was spent by the pharmaceutical industry that was reported for 2012 and made available to the public. So it was about 30 million euro total was spent. The next country to talk about is the UK. The UK has had for decades kind of a dual system of control, complementing systems of control, frankly, in place. Self-regulation by the industry itself via the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, the ABPI, which has a code of conduct that's administered by a group called the Prescription Medicines Code of Practice Authority. And there's also UK law, which is administered by a governmental agency. And those groups have worked together to ensure that the code is up to date and is accomplishing the transparency needs in a way that is satisfactory to the government and achieves their interests and goals in the transparency system. So the UK is really a great example of how government and industry have worked together along with the Netherlands to develop a system that satisfies all stakeholders without the need for specific financial transparency reporting requirements imposed by the government. In that regard, the government and the industry entered into a memorandum of understanding that established different arrangements for the group, and similarly, when the British anti-corruption law went into effect, the Bribery Act of 2010 went into effect in July of 2011, same stakeholders got together and put out an agreement that kind of assigns different roles in terms of supervision of industry and under what circumstances violations of the Bribery Act would likely be prosecuted by the government, while deferring generally to still the self-regulatory model. So by way of background, that's where things have been in the UK. Its first code was in 1958. Its current code went into effect in 2012, and there are actually two different 2012 editions. In the second edition, which is the current one, there were updates to include payments to HCPs, payments to patient organizations, payments to other organizations, non-interventional trials, and those first disclosures were to apply to 2012 data to be reported in 2013. Those have already taken place, but unlike what we've seen in the Netherlands, which is at the individual level, this current system, which will now be outdated as a result of what EFPIA is doing with its disclosure code and moving to the individual level. So just in terms of what's currently there and what companies who are members of the ABPI had to already report this year, consulting requirements, fees paid to consultants, it was the total amount and total number of consultants each year. And we're likely to see these kind of aggregate requirements remain in place until 2016 when the individual level takes over. So even though the ABPI is revising its code, we're likely to still see aggregate kind of in the interim until the final individual level HCP reporting kicks in 2016. So it's still relevant to consider these aggregate reporting requirements at this time. As you can see, there's no requirement to name the individual. And in terms of this is how the UK dealt with a local operating company and how they would estimate overseas affiliates, head offices, and UK-based European offices. Similar type of reporting for meetings, hospitality, and sponsorship, disclosing sponsorship to attend third-party meetings. 2012, total amount paid per year, had to report the total number of recipients, total number of attendees, not required to name individuals. Donations and benefits, again, kept on record and documented. 2012, first reported in 2013. Patient organizations, public list of all organizations had to be disclosed by UK members. But as I've mentioned, it's moving away from the aggregate, although it will be in place likely for a few years until we get to 2016. So as we move to this individual level, there have been a few things and developments that we've seen in the UK. In January of this year, the ABPI issued a press release about work that the Ethical Standards in Health and Life Sciences group, which is a group of 20 different healthcare organizations, be it the medical device industry, pharmaceutical industry, academics, government officials, got a bunch of people together, and they're examining the issue of how they go about implementing individual level HCP reporting in terms of a central registry or some other type of publicly available information, central registry on the company website of the reporting company, or if there's some other way to go about doing it. Another thing to mention about the UK is they had their 2000 reports to cover 2012 data. In 2012, the UK pharma industry spent approximately £40 million in the support in the aggregate that I talked about before. When those first reports came out, as you'd expect, there was a lot of negative press in the British papers and journals and various other places. But the ABP strongly defended its position, talked about how this support was good and necessary for the industry, and how this transparency system was helpful in helping the public to understand all the good that the pharmaceutical industry did in terms of educating doctors, promoting good health, and ultimately benefiting patients. So there was an interesting back and forth about that in the British press. And then the third thing I'd like to mention about the UK before we head off to the Pacific Rim and talk about some of those countries is that the ABPI is already developing its transparency system in a way that is compatible with the EFPIA new disclosure code. As a member of EFPIA, the ABPI has to ensure that its code is consistent with and harmonizes all those disclosure provisions that I talked about before. And for that matter, too, so does the Netherlands. Although it had a system in place, it's going to have to figure out a way to ensure that its system is consistent with and is ultimately as close as possible to the EFPIA system. But the ABPI is already moving along in this process. On July 8th, a letter was sent out to member companies with recent proposals to amend the ABPI code. Those amendments pertain both to changes necessitated by EFPIA's adoption of the disclosure code and various other issues as well, unrelated to disclosure issues. By September 5th, last week, the consultation period closed. By October 1st, final proposals for the new code will be agreed to by the ABPI Board of Management. In November, it will be presented to the ABPI General Meeting, and then January 1, the new code will take effect, implementing EFPIA's disclosure provisions. One thing to mention, the ABPI draft code, and it is a draft code, is available and is online, and it is an example of how an EFPIA member company is going about incorporating the transparency code into its own national code. Next, I'd like to talk about Japan. Here, the Japan Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, JPMA, released guidelines in March of 2011 that required member companies to establish transparency policies based on the guidelines and to publicly disclose payments made to medical institutions and HCPs. Under the guidelines, data is to be uploaded on a company's own website. It's not going to be reported to a central registry like we've seen in the Netherlands. The JPMA, in releasing these guidelines, stressed that the reason for them was to increase transparency of member companies' activities so the Japanese public gains further trust in industry and what it's doing. The JPMA guidelines require companies to get the consent of HCPs in order to post the information in order to comply with data privacy issues. And they do not currently have penalties in place for any violations of these guidelines. Now, the guidelines were announced in March of 2011, and for over a year, everything was kind of going fine. I think it may have just kind of been flying under everyone's radar because first reports weren't required until 2013. But then in August, last summer, 2012, Japanese doctors and their representative groups started to pay attention to this issue and realize that their activities were covered by the guidelines, and they started to express concern about some of the categories that had to be reported. And the main category that they were concerned with is this honorary category. So we have 5 different ones. We have R&D, grants and donations, we have speaking, writing, and consulting, information exchange, meals and hospitality, and you can see annual payments on honoraria, however, on the individual level. So that's really what the doctors and the doctor groups kind of noticed and were perturbed by. So when they realized what was happening and that they were covered, a big fight ensued back and forth between the doctors and JPMA about whether that should be reported. Went on throughout 2012, went through beginning of 2013. In February of this year, the doctors asked the JPMA to postpone reporting for 1 year on that category, but the JPMA refused to do so. Instead, what the JPMA came up with was a different system. So this this slide right here reflects what the initial plan was for 2013 reporting, but for the honorary category, it was changed. That deadline has been pushed back to 2014 for individual level reporting for that category. However, there still does have to be reporting in 2013 for this category on 2012 data, but instead of going to the individual level, companies have to report their overall amount of payments, a list of doctors to whom they provided support, and any institutions that the doctors are affiliated with. However, in providing that list of the individual doctors by name, they do not have to list how much each doctor was provided. That next amount will be what's revealed in 2014 for 2013 data. So that kind of was a compromise between the two different interests. So there will be some reporting this year on that category, but it doesn't have to reveal the amount per individual HCP. We'll be seeing that next year in Japan. One other thing to note about Japan, there's a separate group called the Fair Trade Council of Ethical Pharmaceutical Drugs Marketing Industry. Again, that's a self-regulatory body. It's about 225 members, whereas the JPMA has about 70 or 80. The Fair Trade Council changed its guidelines on meals and entertaining and requires that HCPs can only have $65 spent on them per attendee for meals, and there are also additional restrictions on hospitality that were included in those requirements. This is just a slide kind of covering what I talked about in terms of the back and forth with the doctors. And now here we are in Australia, and this is a timeline to reflect the Medicines Australia, which is the industry group there, another self-regulatory industry scheme that we have here, developed its most recent code, and that is edition number 17, which you may be able to see in the lower right-hand corner. It went into effect in January of 2013. And like the UK system, it has some aggregate reporting requirements that we'll talk about in a moment. Those aggregate reporting requirements were the first time that Australia had adopted that kind of system. It was to cover 2012 data. But it too is moving, like Europe, like EFPIA, to a more individual level reporting system. And it's already hard at work on coming up with their individual level HCP reporting system, which I will talk about in a few minutes. But first, let's just take a quick run through, see we're moving along rather quickly, or it seems rather quick to me, hopefully it does to you too, into the last few minutes of the presentation. So I'd like to try to get through as much as possible with you and try to leave room for a few questions at the end. So in Australia, we have reporting requirements to HCP consultants and advisory board members. The requirements are all here. It's on the aggregate. There are different reporting times for different types of activities. But the great thing about Australia, which is unlike many of the other countries that have adopted these guidelines or similar guidelines on aggregate reporting, here's the initial report for calendar year 2013, annually thereafter for certain categories. This information will be available to you in the slides. But the great thing I was saying about Australia is they actually provide templates and reports as appendices to the code, so it's much easier to kind of get a sense of what all has to be reported and the format it has to be reported as a result of these different appendices. Here we have HCP consultancies with companies. Here we have the advisory boards, and as you can see, that's on a quarterly as opposed to annual cycle. And summary of events, and again, that's on a quarterly as opposed to annual cycle. So that's all the existing requirements, but the government, or some parts of the government, actually had some issues with what was happening with the Australia self-regulatory movement. Earlier this year, a member of the Greens Party in Australia, Senator Di Natale, issued or proposed new legislation that would radically reshape the pharmaceutical industry interactions with HCPs in Australia. It would move much closer under the legislation to a French-type system. There would be individual-level HCP reporting. There would be a lot more restrictions, a lot more limitations, various other thresholds, things like that. So the government took a look at that. The legislature did, conducted hearings, and invited testimony from various witnesses. The pharmaceutical industry, both Medicines Australia and individual members, submitted written comments opposing the legislation. Interestingly, so did the government. The Australian Department of Aging actually submitted comments in which it explicitly said that government supports self-regulation of industry conduct, and it exemplified its support by providing funding in the budget to strengthen the self-regulatory framework, and the government supported the continuation of industry kind of handling itself and not having the government come in and create a system similar to what happened in France. Ultimately, that legislation, which gained some traction in the legislature, was rejected by the Senate committee that was considering it. So at the moment, it appears to be dead, but it could change. Governments change, legislators change. But right now, the movement in Australia is still self-regulatory, and Medicines Australia, the industry group, is already working on that. They developed a transparency working group in an effort to kind of keep pace with what's happening in Europe and some of the other places. That group issued a report in July, and it's going to be considered by Medicines Australia and all the members of the organization as it goes about preparing the 18th edition of its code. In its report, the working group prepared a model for introducing greater transparency into the industry-HCP relationship. In the model, similar to what's happening with EFPIA, companies would begin to report annually in 2016 to cover 2015 data. The information that would have to be reported includes the name of the HCP recipient, his or her locality, other identifying information, of the amount of payment or transfer of value, dates, forms of payments, categories of payments, things like that. There was a debate in the model about should there be a threshold, should there not be a threshold. So that's something that's going to have to be fleshed out going forward. And it'll be interesting to see how close Australia sticks to EFPIA. Obviously, it would be great for industry if it went ahead and kind of followed whatever EFPIA is doing and how it's being implemented in the 33 European countries, so that there might be consistency not only across Europe but also reaching into Australia and maybe some of the other countries that might be considering a trend in this direction and adopting some sort of reform. One quick note before we leave the Pacific Rim: the Philippines has had proposed legislation pending for several years now that would apply to both the medical device industry and the pharmaceutical industry. It would require individual level HCP reporting in terms of benefits, gifts, various other things that are provided. That's just kind of been sitting in the legislature and committee for some time now, but it is something to keep an eye on in terms of potentially becoming active in the future, especially as other jurisdictions go about implementing their own solutions to these issues. This was that Australian legislation, the bill number, that was ultimately defeated in committee. The Middle East and Africa, there is the Middle East and Africa, excuse me, there is a Middle East and Africa Code of Promotional Practices. It's comprised of guiding principles that pharmaceutical companies in the industry developed and enforce in terms of self-regulation. Here are the categories that are covered in that code. It's important to note that there are no financial transparency reporting requirements in the current edition of the code, but again, this transparency movement is spreading throughout the world, so it would not be surprising to see that becoming an issue in the not too distant future. There's been some other developments. South Africa, it adopted a code. Again, not financial transparency related, but we're seeing countries like South Africa, like Tunisia, starting to do their own thing, working off the Middle East and Africa code to apply in their jurisdiction specifically, and putting their own variations on it. MicoMed represents the medical device industry in the Middle East. It's affiliated with EUCOMED, the European representative of the medical device industry. MicoMed has a code of business practice, but like its affiliate, does not have reporting requirements or other information, so it'll be interesting to see if it keeps pace with what its affiliate in Europe is doing. A few concluding thoughts before I take a couple questions. First, going forward, what are we going to see? We'll continue to see this theme, and I've touched upon it, hopefully, and I haven't beaten it to death, but industry codes versus laws and regulations. Everyone involved in this area agrees that there's going to be more transparency, more reporting requirements. Really the key issue is going to be in the form of government laws or industry-based codes. The concept of industry kind of taking care of its own matters and dealing with the public and making transparent on its own terms versus having the government come in and impose all different kinds of things upon it. Obviously, there are many benefits of self-regulation. It's proven to be effective. We've seen what's happened in the Netherlands and other places. Fast introduction, faster than government generally. There's a simple procedure for changes, and you can kind of work together, as we saw in the Netherlands and as the UK is doing, in terms of getting buy-in from the doctors groups, academics, being sure data privacy is respected, instead of the government just coming in and imposing something and then everyone having to scramble to try to figure out how to go about dealing with it. And of course, separate and apart from those specific issues, generally self-regulation is always preferred over those external kind of process and requirements that can be imposed by governments. As we've seen in France, it's been a scramble to keep up with the short time frames and the retroactive nature of what the government is requiring. And it's going to be tough going forward as companies grapple with some of those open questions and ambiguous things. And as we see the kind of debate between industry codes and laws and regulations, I think some of the key things we really need to keep an eye on are how are the EFPIA National Association members, those 33 countries, doing in terms of implementing the EFPIA disclosure provisions? Are governments going to just kind of sit back and wait to see what happens? Will they try to jump in early? Will they wait to 2016 to see what the reports show, see what data is collected and what it reveals? But obviously industry hopes for that kind of deferential approach from the government, but there could be some sort of scandal. What we saw in France with Mediator, the drug that was used for weight loss in addition to diabetes treatment. Something could happen somewhere that leads to a brand new system similar to the scandal in France. So it's tough to predict that, but as countries look at this issue, industry would be well advised to try to be active, try to be aggressive in terms of preempting the field and trying to develop a system that ideally works across borders and that is effective in such a way that governments do not feel the need to jump in and try to figure out their own solutions. Difficulties, there are many in terms of the global transparency movement. One of the issues is, frankly, figuring out where the laws are or the codes are. In Estonia, in Latvia, they're not necessarily under the healthcare reform laws. They could be buried in a tax law, or the reporting requirement could be somewhere else. So sometimes it's tough to find these kind of things. So you'd have to be somewhat of a detective or be consulting with people on the ground or who know how to find these different things in all these jurisdictions that a company may be dealing with. The second difficulty is simply the translation issues. I've probably said the phrase lost in translation 100 times in my life, but until I started doing this, it never really hit me how true it is. It's one thing to get the Slovakian 166-page law and get a cold translation of it. You can put in Google and try to do that, and Google Translate will probably make your computer explode as it tries to translate all that Slovakian law. But even when you get the translation, there are a lot of nuances in the medical device language or the pharmaceutical language that need to be recognized and dealt with as you're figuring out what reporting requirements are, what they apply to, who they apply to, and how they apply in all these different jurisdictions. Another issue, anti-corruption. Anti-corruption prosecutions have been on the rise in some countries. We've seen things in Germany, and we saw the enactment of the UK Act, still waiting. Hopefully it's not an issue and there won't be many prosecutions under any of these laws, but the UK has not been very aggressive so far in publicly announcing prosecutions. But anti-corruption is a huge issue here, especially with ex-US. So many of the HCPs are public officials or employed by the government, so it'll be interesting to see if prosecutors in other countries take a look at what the financial transparency reports reveal and see if there are some patterns, or if they try to use that data in some way in order to be able to make out and prosecute cases against pharmaceutical companies or medical device companies, as the case may be. Another issue, data privacy. We here in the U.S. have a kind of a different view compared to what we see in Europe. Europe is generally more protective of its citizens' data privacy. Companies in the U.S. have to comply with safe harbor or enter into various other contracts in order to get access to European data, and just the reporting in general is an important thing that stakeholders have to be consulted with, as most, if not all, European countries have requirements in terms of how data has to be respected, processed, and ultimately shared with others. I'm going to take a quick look. I've seen various questions coming in throughout, so I'll try to group a few of these. I see that we have a few minutes left. I see that there's a couple questions about France, and I'm just looking. One question about, does it apply the reporting to HCPs that are employed by companies? No, it does not apply to direct employees. That's excluded from what has to be reported. It's only outside HCPs. Another question is, what products are required to be reported on in France under the French law? And the French law actually provides a very comprehensive list, which I won't read to you right now in view of brevity, but it's basically healthcare products that are intended for human use. So that includes pharmaceuticals, just going down the list here, contraceptives, medical devices, in vitro diagnosis medical devices, breast milk collected, classified, prepared, and stored by milk banks, products intended for the cleaning or application of contact lenses, non-corrective contact lenses, cosmetic products, tattoo products. So it's a pretty broad law, so it's going to be pretty tough to have your company, if you're in the pharmaceutical medical device industry, basically you're covered, and it's going to apply to some others as well. I see that I have some questions as well about EFPIA. Let me just see, cross-border issues. That is a huge topic. EFPIA touches upon that a little bit with its disclosure code. Just bear with me a moment. The way the EFPIA disclosure code talks about cross-border is it requires that disclosures have to be made pursuant to the national code of the country where the recipient has his or her physical address. So if you're a UK company dealing with a Greek doctor, it's the Greek system that you would have to worry about, so long as you have a Greek presence in addition to the UK. But if the member company is not in Greece and is just in the UK and doesn't have any affiliates or subsidiaries there, in that case, the member company has to disclose the transfer value to that Greek doctor in a way that's consistent with the UK code. So I'm not sure if I explained that very well, but if you're a UK company with a Greek affiliate dealing with a Greek doctor, that's reported under the Greek system. If it's under the EFPIA code, if you're a UK company without a Greek presence dealing with a Greek doctor, that has to be reported under the UK code. I see some other questions in terms of how do you know if you're a member company? That one is fairly easy to do. You can go to EFPIA's website. The member companies are listed there, and then the national member associations, all 33 countries, they have lists of who their member companies are. So if you're not sure internally, you can go and check on that. A couple questions about, I talked before about how gifts and meals are excluded from what has to be reported under the EFPIA code. Question about whether there are any others, exclusions that is, and there are. Let me just tell you that in one sec. Over-the-counter medicines, that's not covered by this EFPIA code. Gifts and meals, hospitality, that's not covered as a transfer of value. Something that's given as part of an ordinary course of business purchase or sale of a medicinal product, that's not covered. Also samples, medical samples, that is not covered. So that is something that does not have to be reported on as a transfer of value. A couple questions about the EFPIA code in terms of definitions. Events, someone asked about events. There is a definition of events in terms of what has to be reported. Events are defined as all promotional, scientific or professional meetings, congresses, conferences, symposia, other similar events, including advisory board meetings, other similar things that are organized or sponsored on behalf of a company. So it's a pretty broad definition. That information is available on the EFPIA website. Similarly, question about what's an HCP under the EFPIA code. HCP is defined as a member of the medical, dental, pharmacy, or nursing professions, or anyone else who in the course of his or her professional activities can prescribe, purchase, supply, recommend, or administer a product, and whose primary practice or physical address is in Europe. So I see that we are past time. I would like to thank you all very much. The slides will be available. Please feel free to email me with questions. I know I wasn't able to get to everything. I'm sorry. But let me know if you want slides, questions. I'll be happy to talk to you going forward. Thank you all very much and have a nice day.